We're now going to go over to Lizzie Nelson. Lizzie is the UK Director of Search for Common Ground, a peace-building organisation that for over 40 years has been using innovative tools to end violent conflict around the world. And Lizzie is the co-author of a recent project, a recent report, Climate Change, Conflict and Freedom of Religion and Belief, which will frame the rest of our discussion here on climate as a conflict multiplier, but also how faith communities have been responding to that. Thank you for joining us, Lizzie.
Thanks so much, Roche. And I was also previously Director of Faith for the Climate. So it's a real joy to be back with you all. I feel like I'm among friends. So hello, everyone. Thank you for having me back. I thought I'd say a couple of words before we get into the slides, which are more about the report that Roche just mentioned. First of all, to say something about Search for Common Ground. Like, what is a peace building organization? Because when I first started working for them, I thought, what's peace building? Like, really, what does that mean? And the simplest way of saying it, Search for Common Ground works in 40 countries around the world, and all of our teams are made up of the people, local people. It's not kind of Westerners in those countries, it's very much people from the community and reflecting the ethnic and religious makeup of the country that they're working in. And if you think of Search for Common Ground, we're a bit like a development organization, but everything we do is always about trying to build peace. So that could be working with the police to encourage them to communicate better with the local community and to understand them better. It could be working across religious communities. It could be working to empower women to stand for election. We do an awful lot of things, but everything we do in all the countries we work in is about trying to build more peaceful, more cohesive societies. The other little kind of thing I wanted to say before we get into the slides is that we're being funded quite a lot now at the moment to work on freedom of religion and belief. And again, when I first heard about it, I was like, what? What's that? And the simplest way of talking about that is really, it's just a freedom of religion and belief is a human right. It's there in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's Article 18, and it's the right to hold a religious belief or not, to also to express that belief, to worship or to express your faith verbally in any way. It's also the right to change religion. And as you can imagine, in many countries around the world, this human right is at risk and is at threat because it could be that there's religious conflict. It could be that in contexts where minorities are being persecuted. So in some countries around the world, you can be killed simply for the belief that you hold, for expressing that belief, for belonging to a belief community. In some countries, it's not as bad as being killed, but it could be persecution, discrimination, economic discrimination. There's so many different ways in which people's right to express their religious identity is at threat around the world. And Search for Common Ground is being funded to work to try and improve the access to that human right, which is a right for everybody, whatever our background, whatever our belief. So, what led to this report that I'm going to speak about today? We were funded by the Dutch government to work in 7 countries for 5 years on freedom of religion and belief. And the thing that struck us was that in 2 of the 7 countries, we were working with partners, local partners, and international partners in all of the 7 countries. And in 2 of the 7 countries, Indonesia and Kenya, our partners chose to work on environmental and climate issues as a route to improving freedom of religion and belief. And we were really struck by this. We were like, gosh, that's interesting. It's a freedom of religion and belief program, but people are choosing to work on climate issues because that improves freedom of religion and belief. So we thought, okay, there's something really interesting to explore here. What's going on? So that's the genesis of the report that I'm going to share with you now. And I'm so glad that you've heard from Hanuman because he's one of his organization working with Debabrata in India is one of the case studies in the report. And Judy, my colleague, who's country director in Kenya and 2 other countries, will speak to us about the work that Search is doing in Kenya straight after me. So I won't duplicate anything that they have to tell you because they will tell you far more than I can, but I'll just give you some of the information in the background about this report. So Roche, if we could start the slides now, that would be great. Thank you. Great. So if we could go to the first slide. So when we started looking into this, what became very clear from the research is that climate change, armed conflict, and atrocities are interlinked and reinforcing. The United Nations Environment Programme has found that natural resource conflicts are at the heart of over 40% of internal armed conflicts, so civil wars that have been happening in the past 30 years. And Stanford University has done a study which shows that climate change has contributed significantly to the armed conflict risk in the world over the last century, and this will likely increase dramatically. So I think from a conflict point of view, climate change is best understood as a stress multiplier. In fragile contexts, it's leading to increased conflict over access to natural resources and increased migration, which in turn is raising the risk of climate aggravated religious persecution. Next slide, please, Roche. And in contexts where, oh, sorry, Deborah Barata, would you mind muting? I think we're getting a little bit of feedback from your end. So in some countries and contexts where there's already deep religious divides and a history of religious violence and persecution, this,
I'll give you the ID.
Sorry, Mohammed, could you remain muted, please?
I've muted
Thank
him,
you.
Roshas. Thank you. So we see, so for example, what we're seeing in the Sahel and the Great Lakes region in Africa is that violent conflicts have erupted in recent years. And with desertification, which is caused by climate change, you're seeing traditional pastoralist herder communities who in the past had generally quite peaceful relationships with agriculturalists. The pressure on land with the increase of the Sahara Desert is leading to herder communities coming into conflict over land with settled agricultural communities. And due to historical reasons and the impact of colonialism and these kinds of things, traditionally the herder communities have been Muslim, and the settled pastoralist agriculture communities are Christian. And the conflicts that are happening now, triggered by climate change, are not about religion, but because of the background of religious violence that's happened in many of these contexts, it's re-triggering unaddressed trauma of explicit division and violence in the country, alongside and also going on at the same time, this huge increase that we're seeing globally in misinformation and hate speech online, where people are attributing violence to religion, even if it's, or blaming people on violence on religious conflict when it's not always about religion at all, but leading to violence based on religion. So there's an imperative need to address both climate and religious persecution through integrated programming in Nigeria's Middle Belt and other places as part of a broader holistic response to the overlapping crises and to prevent climate aggravated religious persecution. If we could go to the next slide, please, Roche. So just to mention that in addition to places where we're seeing religious violence triggered by climate change, there are people for whom their religion is integrally linked to their being in the land. And just to mention one of these communities, the Mandaeans in Iraq, they practice their entire religion through baptism, and not just once, like in the Christian religion, but on a very regular basis. And these rivers are drying up. So some of the their actual ability to practice their faith is being compromised because of climate change. And in addition to this, traditional and indigenous religions are often deeply linked into the ecosystem, knowing well how to manage those ecosystems, but their voices are rarely heard in climate adaptation and policy making at the national and international levels. Next slide, please, Roche. And I wanted to mention this because I think it's deeply important, even if it's not at the core of the report, that women and girls are at specific risk of religious persecution triggered by the impact of climate change. So when women and girls are forced to move with their families to migrate because of conflict, because of natural resource pressures, when they're in refugee camps or on the move, women and girls from minority religious communities in their context are particularly at risk of sexual violence, basically, and targeted because of their religious minority status. So this is something that a new Open Doors report has found, but I think it's really, and it would apply to all religious minority women, wherever they are in the world. minorities are targeted, and women and girls particularly are targeted with sexual violence. So I wanted to mention this as a particular vulnerability that women and girls are facing in these contexts. Next slide, please, Rish. So finding the solutions. You all at Faith for the Climate know this because it's at the heart of the work that you do through Faith for the Climate and in your communities. Faith communities recognise a shared religious imperative to care for the earth. And as we all know, this can be a very strong foundation for joint climate action. Globally, climate change and environmental degradation are impacting people of every faith. It hurts all of us, and faiths share both the common concern and the common ground in their commitments to protecting the earth. This is something you know, but it's so important to reiterate it because not everyone does get this. So please move on to the next slide, please, Roche. So in terms of finding the solutions, we looked at 4 countries for case studies where interfaith climate action is having a positive impact, and both on the climate and on the environmental impact of climate, and on the relationship between the communities where those relationships are already under stress. I'm not going to go through these in detail because I want to leave plenty of time for Judy to speak and for Deborah Brata if he wants to come in. You've heard from Hanuman already, but one of our case studies was Godamic's work in the Sundarbans. Next slide, please, Roche. Another country we looked at was Indonesia, where Eco-Bhinneka are working across faiths on environmental action in order to bring about better respect between those communities. We could move on, please, Roche. Kenya is where Search for Common Ground is one of the key partners and working with the Kaya community in the Kaya forest. Judy will tell you more about that, so I'm not going to steal her thunder. Move straight on, please, Roche. And the 4th case study in the report, which I personally found very moving, was speaking to the Arava Institute in Israel. The Arava Institute works in Israel, in Palestine, in the West Bank, Gaza, and in Jordan. And one of the things that I found very inspiring speaking to them was that even after everything that's happened since the 7th of October, the partnerships that they've created through joint climate action have remained strong. And I think this is it's a very strong testament to the trust and respect that joint climate action can build, that can withstand even the pressure of the horrible violence and conflict that we're seeing in the Middle East right now. So I'd encourage you to read the report. Roche has put the link into the chat so that you can read more about Arava's work. So those are the 4 case studies. And at the international level, Iyad Abu Mogli, who a lot of you know, works at the UN. He's been very supportive of this report. He helped me in the writing of it and in thinking about it. And he really wanted both to support the findings of this report, but also to stress again the role that Indigenous communities have to play with the expertise that they bring about the land that they live in. And that he sees one of his core roles at the UN in uplifting their voices, bringing them to the table to speak directly to decision makers, policy makers, and funders about what their communities need. So I just wanted to say a thanks to Iyad at this point for his support for this work. And then there's 5 key recommendations in our report. I won't go through them all, but the most important one that I think stood out for me was, and I heard from lots of people, was the need for integration between programming on freedom of religion and belief and the funding that there is for that kind of work and climate programming. So when we're thinking about adaptation and mitigation climate programs to do these things, we should be thinking about the religious impact of that and how you can exacerbate conflicts if you don't take care to, if you give all the money to one community for adaptation programming and leave out some minority communities, that can exacerbate conflict. So we need to think about religious sensitivity in the way that climate programming and mitigation is done. And similarly, we need to think about the potential of climate action to deliver for the freedom of religion and belief outcomes. And when we bring these 2 things together, we can really have a great synergy and deliver both better climate outcomes and better outcomes in terms of freedom of religion and belief, and reduce persecution and reduce, therefore, the conflict and atrocities that climate change is causing. I'll stop there. Very happy to answer further questions later on, but I'd love to hand over now to Judy, who's able to speak to us from Kenya today about the work of Search for Common Ground. Thank you, Roche, everybody, and Judy.
Thank